Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. And today's video comes from a viewer question or suggestion. I was asked to speak a little bit more about the history of the Tower of London. And I'll be honest, when I first saw this question, I was daunted in the extreme. I had no idea of how to even begin to approach this topic. Because when I think of the history of the Tower of London, I think more generally of the site upon which the tower now stands. And when you think about that site, you're talking about millennia of history. Because we think that at the very latest, this site was in use from the Iron Age, before the Roman invasion. How do I cover that much history in a 20 to 30 minute video? Make it interesting, engaging and informative. And then I remembered the work of an artist called Ivan Lapper. And he was commissioned to make a series of impressions of the site of the Tower of London throughout its history. And you can find those on artuk.org and also some of them in this video. I'll be leaving the Art UK link in the description box as well. I think Ivan Lapper's work is a fascinating way to organise this video because it charts the history of the site. And I think that it will be useful for all of us to go through it that way. I hope you enjoy. Of course, I am aware there is a potential downside of approaching this topic in this way, and that is that there may be areas or parts of the topic that you would like me to have gone into more depth about. So I think the fairest thing is for you to watch this video, see what you would like more information on, and let me know, either in the comment section underneath this video, or come over to my social media and comment on the post which I'm using to talk about this video over on Instagram or Twitter. As always, I'll be leaving my Instagram and Twitter linked in the description box as well. What does the site on which the Tower of London now stands offer? Well, it has the River Thames, which is a useful defensive barrier to the south of the site. It, at least at one point, would have been a useful source for water, although I certainly wouldn't recommend drinking, bathing or washing your clothes in the River Thames today. I don't think it's anywhere near clean enough. It was also a vital means of transporting people and goods, and indeed it is still used in that way today. These aspects, which went far in allowing London to flourish into the metropolis we know it as today, have been prized for millennia. And they go some way to explaining the evidence found which suggests that there has been continual activity on the site which now holds the Tower of London for at least as long as that. The Roman invasion of Britain brought a variety of technical advances to everyday life. The Roman skill at road building and revolutionising transport is just one more famous form of this. Nevertheless, controlling the River Thames was still vital for security and trade. The site on which the Tower of London now stands is on the eastern riverside edge of the walled city of Roman Londinium. Part of this wall still stands today. But where it is lost, we are reminded of its presence by the road name London Wall and also by place names like Aldgate, Bishopsgate, Moorgate, Cripplegate, Aldersgate, Newgate and Ludgate. As well as making life in Romano Britain a little easier and safer, this new infrastructure of roads and security networks also stamped the identity of the invading people onto the land they were claiming. Practicality merged with propaganda. And, as we will see, this would become the hallmark for the site of the Tower of London for the rest of its existence. And, arguably, it remains the case today. Roman Londinium and its surrounding wall, like much other Romano-British building work, began to fall into disrepair with the end of Roman Britain. However, disrepair did not mean the same as complete destruction. And this fact would prove to be extremely fortuitous for another invader of England in the 11th century. William, Duke of Normandy, sometime known as William the Bastard, later William the Conqueror, turned up in 1066. Like his Roman predecessors, he and his knights were outnumbered by the existing population, themselves a hodgepodge of migrants, invaders and indigenous peoples. With William's victory at Hastings, he began to fortify his new land. On his orders, building work on the Tower of London and most specifically on the White Tower, as it is now known, was begun. The first version of William's Tower is believed to have been a timber structure, as indeed many of his fortifications were. Evidently, he recognised the defensive value of the remaining Roman wall and the River Thames to the south. He saw the need to fortify London in order to subdue any rebellious uprising. No doubt this was part of his reasoning for replacing his wooden structure with a stone one. The Norman monk Gundulf, who was also Bishop of Rochester, was tasked with overseeing this building project. Cairn stone was imported from France to be carved by Norman masons, but ultimately to be erected by a labour force which was principally made up of the conquered people. The White Tower, as it is now known, was to be a multi-purpose space. By being placed at the easternmost edge of the City of London, on the banks of the river itself, this was a defensive structure that could protect the political and commercial heart of the nation from any attack that might come upriver from the sea. It was a place for the royal household to stay in safety and in relative comfort. It offered residents a place to worship in the beautiful chapel of St. John. It would be a storehouse and a place to house troops. But it was also a clear message to the surrounding community. In a time when the nation's buildings were predominantly single-storey edifices, once finished, William's Tower, which was built on a hill, would be visible for miles around. It was to be an indelible mark of subjugation on the landscape, a reminder and a warning. There was a new world order. Compliance would be in everyone's best interests. William would not live long enough to see his Tower of London completed. In fact, we don't think it was finished until towards the end of the next reign, that of his son and heir William II, also known as William Rufus. However, it is believed the tower would have to wait until the next reign, that of William Rufus's brother Henry I, before it would find itself being put to its most infamous use, that of a prison. In 1100, which is the year that some claim the tower itself was actually completed, Ranulph Flambard, Bishop of Durham, is believed to have been the tower's first state prisoner. Henry I saw him as a useful scapegoat for the unpopular taxation that had been levied during his brother William Rufus's reign. So the story goes. During Ranulph Flambard's 6 months in prison, he managed to hatch a daring plan. Allegedly, he got his jailers drunk on barrels of wine that he had had brought in, and using a length of rope that he had also smuggled in one of those wine barrels, he escaped from a window to a waiting boat bound for Normandy. Now, is this what happened? Or did the man who could believably afford to bring in barrels of wine also have the capacity to bribe a guard or guards to help him escape? Regardless, despite the fearsome reputation that it would come to have in later centuries, as a prison, the Tower of London started out with a 100% failure rate, and Ranulph Flambard would not be the last person to escape. In this image, we are being shown an impression of how the site may have looked in the year 1200, during the reign of King John. The tower and wall have been completed. However, in the wall there is an opening being shown leading to the river. Now we've jumped forward 40 years to circa 1240, a time when Henry III was king. And it seems that the opening in the wall that had once led to the river has now been closed. Henry also is said to have been responsible for ordering the tower to be whitewashed, making it the White Tower. Staying in Henry III's reign, in 1241 we see the inner curtain wall, as it would become, being refortified, and a new moat being dug. Throughout the 1240s, Henry III's work on the Tower of London made it the most secure it had been so far. However, despite all of these improvements, Henry's moat failed to account for the fact that the Thames is a tidal river. Therefore, at low tide, the moat would be, at best, a muddy puddle. Henry III's son, Edward I, widened his father's moat, and he also added sluice gates, which corrected his father's oversight about the tidal nature of the Thames. Now, when the moat was filled at high tide, the sluice gates would close. When the tide went out, the moat would remain full. Edward fortified the castle in a further way. by adding an extra wall. This outer curtain wall made the Tower of London the nation's largest and most fortified concentric castle. Right next to the River Thames, St Thomas's Tower was built, also on Edward's orders. Beneath this tower is the Watergate. It is thought that Edward had his own apartments placed within this tower, which, on the surface at least, doesn't make much sense. It's not the most secure place for the king to be, right on the edge of his defensive structure, vulnerable to attack from the river. However, what this would allow was for Edward to enter and exit the Tower of London and his royal apartments simply by the Watergate. He would not have to move through the body of the tower itself, and he could avoid potentially being petitioned or accosted by people within the tower. During his reign, Edward I did not spend a lot of time at the tower. However, the Tower of London has reconstructed what they think the royal apartments might have looked like, and from this reconstruction we can see that luxury was still possible, and indeed expected. In this image we are being shown a close-up of the detail of what the area in front of the White Tower may have looked like during the reign of Edward I. We have a complex of royal apartments and other buildings, a garden and a great hall. And this complex in some way was still standing in 1533. However, the hall and royal apartments, which at this point were being used to house the Queen, were being refitted in fine style. Further to this, the White Tower itself would be spruced up, redecorated and given the ornamental cupolas that it still sports. However, in 1533 they would have looked even more splendid because they were painted and gilded. All of this, the outlay of money, the display of magnificence, was being done in honour of the coronation of Henry VIII's second wife and queen, Anne Boleyn. Like his predecessors, Henry VIII is using the visibility of his tower to announce the legitimacy of his new marriage and his queen's right to her crown. It was being written in stone. It was unassailable and immutable. Or at least it would be, for as long as Henry willed it to be so. Because as we know, 3 years later, in 1536, Anne would be back in the royal lodgings. Only this time, she would be awaiting her trial. And that trial would take place in the Great Hall at the Tower of London. Once convicted, she would return to those lodgings to await her execution. I would argue that the Tower's fearsome reputation, its most prominent narrative, was most shaped during the reign of Henry VIII. Here we see an artist's impression of the Tower of London at the end of Henry's reign in 1547. This is the Tower complex in its full glory. It is a village supporting Henry's magnificence. A royal mint was installed at the Tower of London by Edward I, and coin was still being minted here during the reign of Henry VIII. Among many things, Henry VIII is of course famous for debasing the English coin, and that great crime against his people was therefore being perpetrated here as well. Henry, like monarchs before and after him, stored his most valuable possessions in the Tower of London. It was also a place where he had his munitions made and kept. We can see Tower Wharf running in front of the tower. This was completed during the reign of Richard II. If we are seeking evidence for the way that Henry VIII's reign affected the reputation of the Tower of London, then as far as I'm concerned, we need look no further than Edward I's Watergate, because that is how it used to be known. But because of the activities and events that were signed off by Henry VIII during his reign, we now know the Watergate by a far more common and ominous name. We call it Traitor's Gate. Here the artist shows us his impression of how the tower may have looked in 1700. William of Orange remains on the throne after the death of his wife and co-ruler, Mary II. From this image, we see that the interior buildings appear to have been rebuilt in brick, and that the Tudor palace that Henry and Anne Boleyn would have known has been replaced. During the reign of Elizabeth I, she received reports of the growing dilapidation of this complex of Tudor buildings. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Elizabeth declined to fund their upkeep, and I think we can all understand why, if we think about her mother's connection to these rooms, and also Elizabeth's own connection to them. When she was imprisoned on the orders of her half-sister Mary I, it is believed that she may have been placed in the same rooms that her mother was kept in, before her own coronation and execution. It is hard to believe that Elizabeth I would not have associated the Tower of London with traumatic and unhappy memories. But nevertheless, she still agreed to fund the upkeep and maintenance of the exterior walls of this site. I believe that, like her father before her, and indeed the monarchs that came before him, Elizabeth I was acutely aware of the propaganda power of the Tower of London, that it was a sign and signifier of her monarchical power and the strength of her nation. In 1841, fire destroyed a range of buildings to the north of the Tower complex. This ruined and burnt-out area would become the site for the Waterloo Block, which today holds the Jewel House and also an active duty military barracks, filled with soldiers who were there to protect the site and particularly the crown jewels. In addition to this devastating fire, during the 19th century, another era ended at the Tower of London. The Royal Menagerie was moved. Here we see an artist's impression of that move taking place. The Tower of London had been home to the Royal Menagerie from the 13th century. Over the centuries, the animals that made their way into the Tower Menagerie had come into the country predominantly as gifts from foreign rulers, made to our own. Included in their number were lions, an elephant, a polar bear, tigers, various exotic birds and primates, all of which were forced to make their permanent home at the Tower of London. Originally, the Tower Menagerie was intended to serve the monarch and their family. It was there for their amusement and also as a sign of their status and power. Eventually, however, the keepers of the menagerie at the Tower of London realised they could make extra money if they were prepared to let tourists in, people who would be prepared to pay for the privilege of seeing these magnificent beasts up close. Unfortunately, there are a number of stories of cruelty, of negligent keeping of the animals, of animals attacking each other and also members of the public. In 1824, the RSPCA was founded. 2 years later, in 1826, the then Constable of the Tower of London, the Duke of Wellington, sent 150 animals away from the Tower to join a growing collection in Regent's Park. This collection is on the site of the modern-day London Zoo. The menagerie finally closed in 1835, and the remaining animals were sold off, either to other zoos or, perhaps more unfortunately, to travelling circuses. This artist's impression imagines the animals leaving the Tower in the mid-1800s. In 2010, Kendra Hast's wire sculptures were commissioned to commemorate the history of animal keeping at the Tower of London. Here we have the Tower as it may have looked in the year 1890, the height of the Victorian period. The river is still clearly a supremely important artery for the nation, full of boats. We are also seeing evidence of the Victorian practice and preference for industrialisation. The moat has been filled in. Indeed, I would argue that through this image we are being shown the most recognisable tower that we have yet to see. What we can't see, because we aren't close enough in this image, is that it was during the Victorian period that the tower really started to come into its own as a tourist attraction, a place where people wanted to visit, to see the crown jewels and, importantly, to hear the tales of the yeoman warders, tales of bloodshed, torture, imprisonment and horror. It was also on Victoria's watch that the Chapel of St Peter of Vincula in the Tower of London underwent a process of restoration. The floor was dug up so that the foundations of the building could be refortified. During this time, unsurprisingly, a number of skeletal remains were found, some of which were moved to beneath the altar of the chapel. Among their number, it is said, is the body of Anne Boleyn. And it does seem that Victoria was quite interested by the fate of Henry's wives, and in particular Anne Boleyn, because, so the story goes, on a visit to the Tower of London, she asked one of her yeoman warders to point out the spot on which Anne Boleyn was executed. Well, he wasn't sure, but he didn't want to say that in front of his queen, so he pointed and just said, "There, ma'am." The spot he indicated is now marked with a memorial. It is said to be the execution site for a variety of people, including Anne Boleyn. Most scholars dispute this was the site where Anne was executed. They think it was further around. But it is during this period, we believe, that that myth, or if we're being unkind, outright fib, first comes into being. Here we see the Tower of London as it may have looked during the nights of 1940, on the occasions when it was subject to the aerial bombardment of the Luftwaffe during the Second World War. To support the war effort, the tower's moat had been repurposed into an allotment with the intention that it would help to feed the people. The Tower of London was also a site where prisoners of war could be incarcerated, and it was also where spies and criminals of this period would face the firing squad. During the bombardment of the Blitz, bombs did fall on the Tower of London. On one occasion, very sadly, a yeoman warder by the name of Reeves was killed. The buildings within the complex of the tower were also affected. The North Bastion was destroyed, and the Mint and the old hospital block were badly damaged. Additionally, the centuries-old Ceremony of the Keys, which still runs to this day even during the pandemic, was apparently shockingly delayed. And this was the first time it had ever happened, according to the record. The officer of the guard wrote to apologise to his king, George VI, for this delay, and he offered his resignation. The king replied with magnanimous understanding that no punishment or resignation would be necessary on account of the bombs. Here is the last of the artist's impressions that I wish to look at. We are being shown the tower in 1999, as I think we all might recognise it. Over the years, the Tower of London has played a wide variety of roles. Many of them it still continues to play. It has been a prison, used to house accused traitors, spies, thieves, murderers, and even people avoiding their military service. This was the case for the last known prisoners to be held at the Tower in 1952. They were the twins, Ronnie and Reggie Cray. Rather than being held for the gangstering that has made them infamous, these East End lads had been conscripted for their national service with the Royal Fusiliers. But on their first day, they seemed to have decided they weren't going to stick around. Ronnie punched a corporal and the pair went home. The Fusiliers were based at the Tower, and so they went and fetched the twins and brought them back. They were going to be imprisoned for striking their NCO, a non-commissioned officer. They were both imprisoned because nobody could be completely sure which one of these identical twins had actually done the punching. I assume that in addition to this violent act, they were also being held for desertion. After a few days being imprisoned in the Tower, the Cray twins were transferred to a place where they could be court-martialled and eventually dishonourably discharged. It's worth mentioning that, should the need arise, the Tower could still be used to incarcerate. The Tower is a royal palace, a place of security, but also comfort and luxury. It has also acted as a place of inquisition, torture, trial and punishment. For centuries, the Tower of London has also provided a home for people who aren't royal, and it continues to do so today. The majority of the inhabitants now are the yeoman warders and their families. In this tower, they have essentially their own village, with a doctor's surgery, a place to worship, and a local pub. As I have mentioned previously, the Tower of London at one time was the home of royal beasts in the Royal Menagerie. It was also a place where the currency of the realm was made in the Royal Mint. It has, and continues to be, a storehouse, a jewel house, and an archive or records office. An active duty military barracks remains on the site. It is, and has been, a world-famous museum. In fact, it is recognised as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. On this site is consecrated ground, a place for worship. There is also a burial site. At one time, the site also held an armoury, a place where weapons would be manufactured and stored. But what do you think? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversation in the comments section underneath this video. Or you can come and find me over on my social media. I'll be leaving links to my Instagram and Twitter in the description box. Follow me there and we can continue this conversation. Once again, a reminder, if there's any part of today's topic that you would like me to go into more detail or depth about, that's the place to come to. Please let me know there. I do hope you've enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, please let me know by hitting the thumbs up. Please also subscribe to the channel, and while you're there, hit the notification bell beside the subscribe button so that YouTube tells you when I've next uploaded. I hope you're going to have a great day whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.